Good evening. I wanted to talk about Q sub elections today. Basically, trying to do a weekly video series and haven't been doing a very good job of getting things out. So, I want to kind of catch up today and talk about something that's been in conversation with a lot of my clients lately, frankly. A qualified subsidiary or a Q sub relates to a subsidiary entity of an S corporation. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what's an S corporation? I've actually got some other videos on my channel that will talk about types of entity and entity structure and what have you. So I'm not going to dive too far into that, except to say an S corporation is either an LLC or an incorporated entity that is chosen to be taxed as an S corporation for income tax purposes. And that election basically is made with a filing a form with the IRS to say that in lieu of being taxed as what we call a C corporation, where the entity would pay its own tax, an S corporation election creates what's called a pass-through entity. A pass-through entity basically is such that the income passes through to the members or the shareholders of the organization. What that means is the entity itself does not pay any income taxes. However, the individual or individuals who own the entity will pay income tax on their pro rata share of the income allocated to them on what's called a Schedule K1. An S corporation in particular files a Form 1120S. And I'll put out a video in a little more detail and show some forms, some examples, and what have you. But really, what I talk about today is whenever you have multiple entities. Let's say you've got two LLCs. Let's say both of those LLCs operate very similar businesses, but you've got different locations. And so, for liability protection purposes, say you put business A, that could be a restaurant, for example, in one town, and business B is another restaurant you bought to own and operate in another town. It could be restaurants, car lots, car washes, any type of business structure. But let's say that in this particular fact pattern, because you wanted separate entities to own these, or maybe you bought an existing business and wanted to keep it intact, but now you've got two tax returns you're filing. Now you got two sets of books that you're keeping. And maybe you really don't want to do that long term, but you still want the ability to be able to track the activities separately and really have the ability to have legal protection on those individual activities by keeping them separated. Well, you can preserve or maintain the same legal structure, but consolidate your tax filing. What you would do is you consider creating maybe another entity, another LLC, let's say, limited liability company. Again, I got a video that talks about those. And then you can make that entity an S corporation. And then you can elect to, by filing an additional form with the IRS, to treat these other LLC S corporations or incorporated S corporations as qualified subsidiaries or Q subs of the S corporation that you just created. We may be asking, well, why would I want to create another S corporation? Why another entity if I already got two? Why can't I just put one under the other? You could do that. The reason you may not want to is if both of those entities have assets. Let's say, for example, you're back to the restaurant scenario. They've got either the restaurant buildings under those or restaurant equipment or what have you. But again, they both have liability, right? They both have things that they generating income that could produce some liability if somebody were to get hurt or something were to happen. And so if it's got assets and you make it 100% owner of the other entity from a Q sub election standpoint, then you've made one entity more exposed than the other. For example, what I mean by that is the parent company has its own operating assets, but it 100% owns the subsidiary entity. Well, if that's the case and the parent company has a liability issue, it owns another entity that also creates assets for it. So you really want to create a holding company structure that has very little assets in it except the individual entities that it owns, because that holding company by itself should not be creating much in the way of any liability if there's not any individual activity at the holding company level. So let's say, I'm Davis CPA Group. So for example, I've got, restaurant A and restaurant B. I might create Davis Holdings, an LLC, make an S Corp election and treat it as an S Corporation. Then I've got to have my attorney help me draft documentation to transfer my ownership 100% of the other two entities that I've got into my Davis Holdings company. And then with the IRS, I'd file an S election for my new business I created. The next day, or the day after, or the day I created my documentation to move the entity in, I would make a qualified subsidiary election, a Q sub election. And then past that, I could go a step further and actually make an entity classification election, particularly if these were LLCs, and treat them as disregarded entities for the future. And again, that may play into some future conversations we'll have about how to structure buying and selling of a business and treating it as maybe an asset deal, but selling the entity structure and what have you. But I just want to jump on a quick video today just to talk about qualified S corp subsidiary S corporations or Q sub elections and why they might be important. Really, the biggest piece of that puzzle is to say I want to consolidate my tax filings, maintain my legal structure by having the separate legal entity still preserved at the local law level, but allowing me a little bit more efficiency in how I do things. Another area this could be beneficial too is accounting, keeping the books of the entity itself. A lot of times, a lot of people use QuickBooks, QuickBooks Online, QuickBooks Desktop, or other accounting softwares that might allow you to do class tracking. Well, if I have separate legal entities and I have separate tax filing requirements, separate payroll tax filing requirements, all these things, then I may have to keep a separate QuickBooks file for each one or a separate accounting file for each one. Whereas if I consolidate my entities under one parent holding company, now I've consolidated my filings, and maybe I do QuickBooks Online, I do class tracking. I can say, here's my income and expenses for restaurant A, here's restaurant B, kind of going back to that restaurant example I kind of started with. It allows you to maybe eliminate some of the extra steps in doing your accounting work, particularly if you've got a little bit of interplay between the two entities from the standpoint of buying in bulk from one entity and then allocating some of those costs to another. So a lot of benefits around this potential structure. Looking forward to putting out some more content around that, but just want to put something out there to give you some thoughts or maybe answer some questions if that's something that's come up in any of your personal situations. As always, have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.